After a very enlightening morning talking about America, the Americanization, and also the global South, now it's the turn for Europe. Europe with a question mark. We decided not to say Europe after America, knowing that, or being aware of how the concept of the West after the Cold War is now fading, and Europe is kind of showing some search for independence from the US, but at the same time we were also witnessing the rise of the extreme right in many different countries in Europe, a search for rearmament as well. So we're wondering what's the soul of Europe today? No, what kind of values Europe can today contribute to the world? So I wanted to ask you, the three of you, two of you are not European, although you have a deep knowledge of Europe, and Pankaj, we can say that lives in Europe most of the time. And Jose, who is a very dear colleague of the CCB, he's from Spain. He has done all of his career in the US. He's a professor emeritus of in Austria first, sorry for the German background. He's a professor emeritus at Georgetown and also part of the Berkeley Center for Peace, Religion, World Affairs that Tom is directing. So it's a pleasure to welcome you back at the CCB and in Barcelona. Jose, thanks for being here. So I'll ask you a first contribution about your personal perspective on Europe. Pankaj, would you like to start first?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. Is this working? Yes. Yeah, it is. Okay. I think I might start by a little sort of autobiographical digression. This year, I remembered, I was in Paris a month ago, that exactly 3 decades ago, I came to Europe for the first time. In fact, that was the first time I left India. And in that same trip, I traveled across Europe. I also went to the United States. I was 26 years old. And I think there were many things I was obviously surprised by. But the thing that I remember being struck by most was the Americanization of Europe. And I think it may have had something to do with my own somewhat naive sense of what Europe was or had become after 1945, and I think 1945 is the crucial, is when the crucial period begins, where the idea of the West or the Western community becomes very dominant, and this is partly in response, largely in response to the threat of Soviet communism. So the idea of the West, to which Western Europe and United States belong, and forming some kind of a community of interests, of values, of traditions. At least that is the rhetoric. Now in India, we were actually extremely remote from these conceptions and these ideas. We were inhabiting a different temporality altogether, which was of decolonization. And in that process of decolonization, there was a great distrust of both the United States and Western Europe. Western Europe in particular, because we had only recently won our independence from British imperialists. And of course, United States, because it was seen as a bad actor in that part of the world, especially supporting military dictatorships in Pakistan. So looking at Europe and America from India, we saw these actually quite distinctive entities. We didn't have too much knowledge about them, speaking of kind of average newspaper reader. But if you made the effort to inquire more into the history of Europe and the United States, it became very clear that the two had been on separate trajectories for a long time. And the European writers that I read, the European, not just novelists, but also thinkers, philosophers, artists, they were clearly responding to what were very uniquely European calamities of the first half of the 20th century, the 2 world wars, the Holocaust. And America really did not play a great role. I mean, obviously its armies were involved, but in terms of an artistic and intellectual reckoning with those calamities, America was largely absent. I think it's possible to argue that the United States did not produce on its own figures like Hannah Arendt or Camus, or these were all people deeply formed by the calamities and tragedies of Europe. And their thinking developed in response to that. So in India, if you became aware of that, you became aware that there is a very distinctive European tradition in philosophy, in literature. So for someone like that, someone like myself, to arrive here and to see a kind of Americanization that was not only confined to McDonald's. I remember being really shocked, even scandalized, by seeing McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken in Prague. I'd gone there with this idea of Prague as the city of Kafka and perhaps Václav Havel, and here were these golden arches. But I think that what was also more surprising was that when I talked to European journalists, especially a younger generation, it was very interesting talking to people in Prague who had come through the sort of communist era, who were still Europeans in the sense that they were invoking European histories, European sort of certain European philosophical traditions. But the younger generation of journalists in places like Berlin and Paris, Amsterdam, were really extraordinarily Americanized to the degree they had spent a lot of time in America, they had gone to American universities, they had internalized the American view of the world. And then, of course, there were writers and artists. I'm going to come back to this, my time is up, I've been reminded, who wanted desperately to be in America. Novelists, historians, openly saying that that's where the power is, that's where we want to be. Neil Ferguson, my old friend, saying that he wants to be in New York because that's where the wealth and power is. He actually said that. And this is quite pathetic what we have here in the UK. So there was this enormous attraction for the United States and the assumption that the politics of the United States, the economy of the United States, these were models to which not only Europe, but the rest of the world should aspire to. And obviously, that kind of thinking is in serious trouble now. But I'll stop here.
Great. Well, first of all, wonderful to be here with all of you this afternoon. Judith, thanks again for your hospitality. This has been a wonderful convening. The Georgetown Global Dialogues moves forward, and thanks to your wonderful team and this tremendous facility in these spaces, it's been a terrific experience. There's so many places to go with this topic, and I suppose mine is also a personal approach in the sense that I'm kind of putting on my hat as a social scientist or a political scientist, but at the same time trying to link back to some of the conversations we've been having, particularly the themes of solidarity, powerlessness, cruelty, and of course de-Americanization, which we touched on this morning. So I want to begin with the sort of darker world which we've evoked together over the last couple of days, a world divided where cruelty is rife and we have this widespread sense of powerlessness, where nationalism and tribalism are resurgent and fraternity and solidarity are on the back foot, where the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must, a world which the United States under Donald Trump, as we discussed this morning, is pushing forward. This is a world of so-called realism, of power politics, of self-interested actors with the U.S. in the lead, seeking to maximize their wealth and security. But I want to suggest that that realist view is just that. It's a view, it's a perspective, a lens that captures the dynamics of world politics only partially, and that obscures causes for hope. We've often ended our conversations here grasping for strands of hope. And I think there really is cause for hope in a world after U.S. hegemony, and that Europe, despite all its problems and failings, has a key role to play. But first, and I'll cover some of the same ground that Pankaj mentioned, I want to apply the the realist lens to the European story. It's a familiar narrative that goes something like this. Europe destroys itself in two fratricidal wars. The United States and the Soviet Union divide the continent, imposing their ideologies, political and economic systems on the East and the West. Under US hegemony, NATO and the European Union take shape. They're designed to constrain German power on the one hand and, of course, contain the Soviet Union on the other. And when the Cold War and the Soviet bloc end, US hegemony is extended eastward through NATO. At the beginning of the 20th century, and we've talked about this, we have the shift toward multipolarity after 9/11, the disastrous wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the global financial crisis, the rise of China. The US position weakens in relative terms globally, and strains emerge in US-European relations. And now, of course, in Trump's first and second term, we see those strains in full view. Trade war on the one hand, and concerns about the US commitment to defend Europe against the backdrop of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So this is sort of the default. This is the power-centered view of history that leaves Europe after America completely adrift, really, internally divided, forced to chart a more independent role in an unstable and dangerous multipolar world. I think it's an intuitively appealing story. It's one we know well. There's lots of evidence to support it. But we can also view the present and the past differently, through another lens, through a focus not just on raw power politics, through which the strong dominate the weak, but through a focus on the collective efforts, however imperfect, to build institutions that address common problems of violence, oppression, inequality, and environmental destruction within and across countries. And if we look at that world today, and we've tried as best we can, we see not only brutal power politics, but shared existential challenges that cut across borders and that can only be met through cooperation, whether it's climate change, the AI race, or nuclear annihilation. And such cooperation, if it's to be sustained, of course, requires institutions, shared norms, values, and processes that bring countries together to negotiate and settle their differences peacefully, with an eye toward their own interests, of course, but also to the common good. All right, I want to come back to the present, but let's apply this institutional perspective to Europe's path, and it allows for a different historical narrative, one more hopeful than the realist one. And in this story, it's the same story, but somewhat different characters. After the death of millions in World War II, after the Holocaust, leaders in Germany and France and other European countries decide to break out of a destructive cycle of violence through the construction of new institutions, a coal and steel community to launch European integration, a treaty on peace and reconciliation between France and Germany, a European model of social democracy with a commitment to, European model of democracy with a commitment to social justice, which draws both on Christian democracy and social democracy, which itself was an effort to overcome the class divisions of the interwar period that led to or contributed to fascism and war. And let's not forget that at the global level, French, German, and other European leaders throughout the post-war decades really embraced the UN as a framework for the promotion of peace, economics, and social development, selectively, of course, but perhaps less selectively than the United States. From an institutional perspective, the collapse of the Soviet bloc was an opportunity to extend European institutions and democratic and social justice norms eastward. And then, of course, with the global financial crisis and Trump's unilateralism, we've seen strains on EU institutions. As Judith mentioned, the rise of the far-right economic stagnation. But still, the EU plods ahead. The unhinged national rivalry that could culminate in war among its members, that kind of war remains unthinkable today, even amid all the stress of this multipolar world. So, in conclusion, Europe after America, if we move back to the present, is not simply adrift in a multipolar world, if we look at it through this lens. Not simply caught between the great powers, the US, Russia, and China, with its leading countries, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, thrown back on their national security and economic interests. Europe remains bound together by strong political and economic institutions. It's trying to build security institutions. And at the international level, it's the most vocal and influential advocate of the UN system and for more robust institutions to advance shared solutions to the existential problems that I mentioned. Adorne talked about ethical imagination. Can we imagine a more hopeful future, just imagine, in which Putin's aggression is defeated, and I know you'll speak to this, Jose, where the European Union works with China and other nations across the so-called Global South to strengthen and reform the United Nations, and eventually a post-Trump America, and we see glimmers of hope there, actually abandons its, or our, I'm an American, unilateralism, and rejoins international institutions. A multipolar world that ends not with world war, climate collapse, and technological dystopia, but with conflict and competition balanced by cooperation for the global common good. If we can imagine that future, we can work towards it. I think in Europe, with its own history of institutional transformation, will have an important role to play.
So, well, Judith, thank you so much. Tam, thank you so much. Pancas, thank you so much for bringing us together here. It's a great pleasure to be back in Barcelona. Excuse my voice, I have a bad cold, and I was rushing here from another meeting, another dialogue between Muslims, Jews, Catholics, and Orthodox here in Barcelona right now. It's great to be in Barcelona. Half of my village emigrated to Barcelona in the 50s and 60s, so I know a lot of people in Barcelona that feel like Catalans, although they came from my village. As you said, I left Spain very early to go to study in Austria. I was 18 years old, studied theology in Innsbruck, German theology, both Protestant and Catholic, right after Vatican II, when everything was thinkable. So I'm a Spaniard that grew up under the Franco regime, a very, very isolated provincial society. Intellectually, I've been shaped by German theology. Before becoming a sociologist, I was a German theologian. And it was then that I decided I wanted to study German sociology in the Frankfurt School. And my very, very clever professor of theology told me, if you want to study German sociology, go to the New School for Social Research in New York, because if you go to Germany, you'll study American sociology, and he was right. So I became an American in order to study German sociology. And since then, in the last 50-somewhat years, I've been a European in America, an American in Europe. Besides being, if you wish, a Spaniard, German, and American, and again, American means when I study theology, was the time of liberation theology, and Latin American developments have been part of my very much sociological imaginations from the 1960s as well. In addition, I married a Ukrainian woman, a Ukrainian American who was born in a DP refugee camp after World War II. There had been camps for Ukrainian refugees after World War I, camps of Ukrainian refugees after World War II. They are refugees for Ukrainians again. So it's the third time the Ukrainians are on the move. Look, no other people have suffered as much the 20th century as Ukraine, other than the Holocaust, the Jewish people in Europe. But of any nation, World War I was fought on Ukrainian soil, the Eastern Front. The Bolshevik Revolution, the Civil War, Russian Civil War, was fought, the Reds, the Whites, the Maginot Army of Anarchists, the Pilsudski Army, Polak Army, the Pilsudski Army, all the main battles were fought on Ukrainian soil. Came the Great Holodomor, about 6 million Ukrainians died of basically artificially created hunger. And then came World War II that was mainly fought on Ukrainian soil, more than on Russian soil. More Ukrainians, both soldiers and civilians, die than any other country in Europe in World War II. Okay, so this is an aside to understand where my heart is. I'm a European, And I'm a proud American in the same way somebody said that I'm a proud American, an immigrant. Half of the immigrants in America are like me, people that came with a higher education and income than the rest of the American population, and that American society gave them opportunities. I was elected president of the American Society of Religion, right? I didn't even, my Spanish accent is so clear in English and in German, in French. Not in Ukrainian, no. In Ukrainian, they think I come from the Transcarpathian Mountains. And so, where are we? Yes, I hope that Europe gets its act together, frees itself now from America, to become a Europe for the world, not to become another superpower competing with China and the other superpowers, but precisely to be representative of what they say, the European values, European universal values. Well, let's do it. Let's do it. This demands that Europe recognizes its history of colonialism, recognizes precisely the role it has played in creating this world. We talk of global capitalism, but the other fundamental dynamic of our global system is the Westphalian system of nation states that was created in Europe to homogenize the populations, to based on ethno-religious cleansing. Every modern European nation was born through ethno-religious cleansing, and this model has been globalized across the world. Every nation state in Asia, in Africa, you have some kind of ethno-religious or ethno-linguistic cleansing. And this is part of the European, if you wish, legacy. So only if we recognize the role we've played in the formation of this totally unfraternal globe, then we'll be in a chance to play the role of reforming global institutions so that we Europeans are not anymore the powerful, are not the center of the world, are not the powerful, but can represent the interests of all in a way in which it unifies all against the big man, against the superpowers that otherwise are going to divide up the world among themselves. So again, we can continue this conversation, the form it may take, but for that Europeans have to be conscious, mea culpa, rethink their own history, learn their own history. They don't know their own history. Of course, today in our politics, it's almost impossible. So this is a dream to think that in our conditions of political polarization in Europe, we can recognize the fact, the role which Europe has played in the formation of these global structures. So.
Thank you very much, the three of you. This morning, when we were listening to the panel on America, I was struck by the idea that Mohsin Hamid suggested about the increasing gap between the idea and the imagination of the US and the materiality of the reality, of the economic, demographic, technological reality of the US. And I was wondering whether this same gap is also applying for Europe, the idea that Europeans or Europe has about itself and the reality that has nothing to do with this idea of being the daughter of the Enlightenment, of this Europe that was born after the Second World War, that never again project in a continent that has never stopped seeing a war inside and outside the continent. Also, this idea of a post-colonial Europe, the fact that we don't recognize in the political, institutional framework of Europe the new demographic reality of Europe, which has to do with this, what you usually call, Pankaj, the most important event of the 20th century, the decolonization. So I was wondering whether we could apply the same analogy of this increasing gap between the idea of Europe and the reality of Europe.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom and Jose. I think, Tom's proposal, which is a very urgent one for Europeans to forge new relationships with the rest of the world, including China, to confront and try to solve these formidable challenges like AI, climate change, and of course, new institutions, global coordination are needed for all this. But I think for all of that to happen, I think, first you need to prepare an intellectual culture, a political culture, in which we can look at reality without this enormous gap Mohsen spoke of. When Jose talks about confronting the history of colonialism, why is it that, I think it's worth asking, that there were many more people in Britain, France, the major imperialist powers, in the 40s and 50s, many more people, many more distinguished figures, from Simone Weil to Albert Camus, openly recognizing the evils of colonialism. And today, you have mainstream politicians in these countries, especially Britain, and sort of the mainstream publications saying the British Empire was a wonderful thing. Why is it that the state of delusion, a state of ideological intoxication, has become deeper? And I would blame it at least partly on this fantastical idea of the West that was created after 45 in response to Soviet communism, a big ideological political formation in which you could be included if you subscribe to certain American notions, if you accepted apprenticeship to the United States politically, economically, militarily. So if that was the price of the ticket back to respectability, back to stability, then you need not confront these histories that Jose is talking about. So today it's worthwhile asking, did Germany truly democratize with all the Nazis present in public life? Or was Germany accepted too quickly into the so-called Western community, and the problems that we saw in German history, the problems of anti-Semitism, the problems of ethno-racial nationalism, those problems are re-emerging today, racism. I think it's worth asking, what was this process of democratization? Was it just rhetorical at some level? You said all these things like Eastern European countries like Poland, Romania, failing to confront their history of anti-Semitism after the end of the Cold War, but simply signing up to all these documents, like the ICHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Let's embrace this and let's move on. Then you get a certificate, So all these reputations, all these histories being laundered, and you become a stalwart member of the Western community by extending support to Israel. So if this is the shape of the European community, obviously, I think we have a long way to go before we honestly confront what happened here in the long 20th century, the so-called age of extremes. So I would argue that we are quite far away. We've moved even further away from a true and honest reckoning with that history of the kind that people like Hannah Arendt were undertaking back then. And here we are in a very different intellectual and ideological situation today.
Yeah, I want to agree with you, Pankaj. So just to share something autobiographical, I'm married to a German. I've lived in Germany for 7 years. And there's a lot of truth to what you say, particularly in Germany, the danger of the institutional narrative that I shared of turning one's back on the past and becoming a sort of model democracy as a way of not dealing with a delicate, if not catastrophic, past in so many ways. And the same lesson applies to European colonial history, including, of course, German colonial history. So that work must and should continue. There's also a danger that as the U.S. retreats, as it is now, as I said, my hope is that another America will re-engage with institutions, but that as the U.S. retreats, Europe will try to mimic some of the Western behavior, if you like, of the hegemon, or the previous hegemon. We saw a little bit of this in the celebration of 35 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall and German unification just a couple of months ago, where Macron and Merz together talked a lot about democracy and human rights on a global scale, and talked, I think, about an autocratic axis and this kind of thing as a way of distinguishing Europe from China and other countries. I, for one, believe in universal human rights. There's a difference, I think, between democracy and dictatorship, between Europe, say, and China. But as we move into a multipolar world, this language, especially given the historical background we've been discussing, can be counterproductive, and if pushed too far, can make it harder to find shared solutions to some of our common problems.
Yes, the question is how far do we go back? I tend to go very back far. For me, 1492 is the beginning of modern European history because it's the expulsion of Jews and Muslims from Spain, is the model of the Westphalian nation state. Cuius regio, eius religio. The sovereign determines the religion of its subjects. Not because the sovereign is the Leviathan. As we know, the Leviathan determines the confessionalization of the state and of the people. And 1492 is, of course, the discovery of America, the beginning of the first globalization, the first circumnavigation of the globe, that it was possible to understand all of us as parts of one single globe. And here I spent the last 20 years studying precisely these first encounters of globalization, before Western hegemony. In Asia, these encounters took place before Western hegemony. Western hegemony in Asia only begins around the 1800s, in India a little earlier. Otherwise, and the Chinese walls, Japanese walls are only broken in the 1860s. So in this respect, the kind of globe that it was not a hegemonic Occidental globe. Now it is, but at the same time, for me, the hope comes from the fact that this continent that was based for 300 years on fighting country against country, nation against nation, constant warfare in Europe, came to an end through the European Union. And here I have to argue social democracy comes later. At first, it was purely a Christian democratic project, a Catholic project, the Treaty of Rome. No nationalist party, certainly not Gaullism. No Protestant country, certainly no Scandinavian country, certainly not Great Britain. And no socialist party was interested in the European Union when it started. It became a social democratic party project later. At first, it was a project of Christians, especially French Catholics, linking with German Catholics already under the resistance, saying we have to reconcile. And the same I would go about the Eastern, Western Europe. It was the Poles, it was the Polish bishops that wrote to the German bishops to ask for forgiveness. It had been the Germans, of course, that did the damage to Poland. The point is that, for me, this model of Europe, of course, sadly, the nation state has been globalized with the same effects it had in Europe everywhere else. The nation state, of course, on the one hand, is the condition for democracy, and without it, we don't know how to have democracy without the nation state. But the nation state itself is the real problem. And so how can we then transform our global structure in a way which is not based on simply this nationalism? How can we reform the global system of nations, not based on this? And ultimately, we have to get rid of the superpowers that have veto power in the United Nations. Unless we do that, there is no possible reform of the United Nations. And of course, those are the exceptions. They impose the rule on others, but those rules don't apply to them. And so, yes, Europe, we are in the worst condition right now politically to even acknowledge those things, to begin talking about those things. But we must. We must, because what is at stake is otherwise the division of the world among big men, the masters of the universe, all men, all these that are obscenely billionaires, that are simply trying to transform the world for them. And somebody was saying creating a space for them to even leave us down here. The big men of Xi Jinping and Putin dreaming about living up to 150 so they can continue being presidents of Russia and China for another 50 years. And the Trump. So this is the thing. This is the other alternative we have. Yeah. Unless we do that, this is the alternative we have. I don't believe that realpolitik must be. Realpolitik, of course, if we made out of the fact a norm, of course, we're in trouble. Realpolitik is simply, yes, this has been the facts, but it shouldn't be like that, and it cannot be. It could be otherwise. And for that, I think the Global South, of course, will also have to think some of its own histories in different ways. This is, I think, is Global South. There are completely different dynamics in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia. I spent a lot of time studying Asian. My last two books were really on Asian Catholicism and how in the last 500 years Catholicism became Asian. And yes, we have to start thinking of each other in terms of identities that are not based on the nation state, they're not based on, are based on many other things. But anyhow.
Thank you, Jose. I was thinking that one of the purposes of the global dialogues was to enrich the global conversation, to enrich and enlarge the European discourse, the Western discourse, with other voices, other traditions, other genealogies of thought. And we've been listening to a lot of Global Southern fellows these days, and I was wondering whether you could help us also identify in the own European intellectual archive some thinkers that could today illuminate the current state of the world. I mean, how could we put in dialogue some of our own traditions, the European traditions that could be useful to understand? I know you were talking about Simone Weil, about Albert Camus, no? What other writers, thinkers would you think could help us illuminate and be in touch with this new state of the world?
Thank you, Judith, and thank you also, Jose, for also highlighting a problem, which is that of the nation state. And of course, the first half of the 20th century was a gruesome laboratory for this idea of the nation state. That was obviously the culprit for the mass killings that we saw, the ethnic cleansing, expulsions, and so on and so forth. And I think, after 45 and even before that, during those dark decades, the 20s and 30s, there were already people reflecting on this, these monstrosities of ethnic racial nationalism, trying to move beyond them. And some of them after 45 had the opportunity. Tom and I wrote this op-ed which is now online at the New York Review of Books, thanks to Emily. And it's about these intellectuals who came up with alternative ideas, critiques of the nation state. Jacques Maritain comes as an excellent example of someone with a continent-wide influence, who engaged with not only politicians, but writers, artists. I think the trouble when I think about that moment in the 40s and 30s, and when I look at leaders today, when I look at mainstream intellectuals today, especially in these sort of, once very prominent countries like France or Britain, you are plunged into despair because the material for transformation has gone missing, and that has to do with the way the intellectual life has been structured or political life has been structured. But you go from country to country, you look at the leaders, the caliber of the leaders, like the German chancellor, who used to work for BlackRock, who proudly claims he doesn't read books. It's extraordinary. This is a you look at him, tall guy, you're forced to conclude that he's a human pinstripe. There's nothing going on there intellectually, morally, and it's really shocking to realize the kind of people who have occupied this position. Even the previous chancellor, who was an extremely well-read person, who was inviting Richard Sennett to the chancellery to talk to him about. Macron, of course, huge disappointment. Keir Starmer, the less said about him, the better. Meloni trying to, placate Trump so as to, receive some benefits, some pathetic little benefits from him. I think in that context, I would say, since we are in Spain, that even though, the modern history of European violence begins in Spain with the expulsions of Muslims and Jews, but maybe Spain is called upon to play a different role. It did not undergo the kind of Americanization after 45 that other Western European countries. In this moment, you can see very clearly, and for those of us in other countries, in Pakistan or India, it's very clear that it's Spain that has maintained, along with Ireland and to a lesser extent some of the Scandinavian countries, the credibility and legitimacy of European institutions, especially on Gaza. That is one country that has made clear, both at the level of public opinion and also the level of government, their opposition, and also said, look, we don't have any credibility in the rest of the world if we don't step away from the American line on this and take an independent position. So the European Union as an idea, as a solution to the problem of nationalism, which, many of us used to envy, living in South Asia, where we've been locked in wars, confrontations for a long time, wasting national resources on these pointless wars. The idea of a federation is hugely attractive. It's a model. But European Union will not count for much if it cannot incarnate some very basic moral values. And I think, this is where the parasitism on Trumpist culture, administration, is really dangerous, I think, because I think Europe risks losing a credibility, a reputation that it has actually enjoyed separately from that of the United States for some time at least. And I think Spain probably has an important role to play in all this, even though it's not clear and it's a small country, it's not immediately clear or evident. But anyway, I'll stop here.
Told that we have to transition to questions, but meanwhile, perhaps Jose and Tom want to respond to Pankaj on this.
Yes, briefly. I'm not so hopeful about Spain because Spain is so caught up in its own internal conflicts that it's impossible to. I mean, to me, it was obvious. I mean, I've admired Catalonia a lot. Small society that was able to incorporate immigrants, view itself as a kind of leading Mediterranean nation, and came Catalan nationalism, came the Arab Spring, and there was no interest whatsoever in what was happening where Barcelona had been, this city leading into Mediterranean issues, Mediterranean questions. And now we are caught up so much between our internal conflicts that it's probably not possible really to play this role today. Again, this about Spain. I think if we could go back, 1975 was the Helsinki Treaty. It was the first time that every European nation signed a treaty based on two principles. It was tough because it was basically Western Europe, capitalist Western Europe against socialist Eastern Europe. And the agreement was, it was the Soviet Union that wanted the recognition of the inviolability of territorial borders. In exchange for it, it was the Soviet Union that was afraid that the West would change the borders of socialism, Germany, but socialism in general. That in exchange, they were willing to give up this notion of human rights that nobody thought will have any impact on the Soviet Union. Of course, it has been completely the opposite. It was the Helsinki Watch, the Helsinki dissidents that actually led to the fallout of the Soviet Union. And it was Russia that has basically violated the borders and opened up the question of the territorial borders in Europe that had been closed, and we thought that we had overcome it. So the issue is, to a certain extent, because those are issues which have been reopened everywhere else, Europe needs to get its act together. And the only way of doing it is they have a break with America in the sense that they cannot trust America anymore. So Trump, in this respect, may help Europe get its act together, but I'm not fully confident. I hope, and I'll be a European voice on these issues, but. And let me say that in Europe, the papacy plays a crucial role geopolitically on all these issues. It's very important to understand the voice it has played on all these issues throughout this stuff. And Father Spadaro can talk about it.
There's a question there. Uy. There. And Nicoleta, and then here, and Paul.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking on this topic. I think it's very interesting. I have a question more generally of Europe getting its act together, of course, with the threat of Putin. Does that mean that Europe needs to now individually militarize? Is that the answer? Draining the social safety net and building up our militaries because the U.S., we can't trust them anymore. Is that the answer? I'm a bit concerned, of course, that the social safety nets are going to be at risk. And that the answer is going to be this macho militarism, as Tom alluded to, this kind of copying of the American strategy internationally. But I also can't blame countries who are scared of Putin's threats, especially the ones closer to him. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on what the answer is regarding that.
If I may be first, because this is a very tough issue for me, supporting Ukraine and the struggle to create a situation in which stalemate happens and a peace is negotiated, in which then Ukraine is secure and can then develop simply a European country. But for this to happen to a certain extent, it's only if somebody defends Europe from Russia. And I mean, let's face it, of course you could say once Ukraine cannot be Russia anymore, perhaps the imperial dreams of Russia will disappear. I don't think so. So anyhow, it's very tough because indeed, the last thing I want is to have a militarized Europe. The last thing I want is to have one in which all kinds of social service, education, health, even the support of immigrants cannot be defended because precisely people are building military. So it's a very tough question. And on the other hand, Europe can only become independent of America if America cannot chantage Europe with, on the one hand, we protect you, on the other hand, you do what we tell you to do. So it can only develop its own global policy once it becomes independent of the US. But independent of the US means not becoming independent of Russia. Russia would like to destroy the system of European Union and go back to the system of European states competing with one another, because they know that they can, the same way that Trump thinks that they can, Trump alone can negotiate deals with every country. Putin knows that Russia is the most powerful country in Europe if it becomes a European nation in this kind of negotiation. So it's a very tough question. I hope that we can do both, but I don't know how to do it.
Tom, would you like to respond on this? Or there's another question there.
Yeah, let's get some more questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this wonderful panel and for the entire Congress so far. This has been very productive to think with. And I was thinking in particular about what kind of things have you participated in or could imagine as alternatives, kind of places or institutions through which to think. And I was thinking in particular, last night I was watching some of the videos because there's going to be an International People's Congress for Palestine here in Barcelona later this month. And this is a people's justice initiative that they produce a verdict, and that verdict gets disseminated to major institutions, the UN Human Rights Commission, courts at the regional state level. It's a grassroots, people-powered, people-funded initiative, but the political effect of it is to move knowledge and justice, accountability upward into these kinds of institutions. And I was also thinking about, there used to be these world congresses in the early 20th century, before late 19th, early 20th century, with intellectuals across the world moving and meeting one another. What kind of spaces could we conjure today to do this kind of work, to sort of, for example, decolonize Spanish thought, decolonize Spanish history, decolonize European history, and push a new kind of knowledge upward rather than wait for things to change?
Well, maybe that's a great question, and we talk about moving toward a more hopeful future and how do we actually get there. And we've had some interesting conversations with the Georgetown and Blackkaerna students about the timeline for this. You know, do we need to initiate processes now, the kinds of meetings, which have always existed, but do we need to double down on these convenings and seek to get to know one another and share our ideas and move things forward over time? Or is there more urgency to what we're doing? I think what a university can do, a university like Georgetown is trying to do through these dialogues and through other initiatives, is to really connect young people around the world, help them share ideas around the common challenges we face, elevate their voices. So I think that's what universities can do best. But Pankaj, you've given this a lot of thought as well. What do you think?
Thank you. You know, I've been actually inspired a great deal by this tradition, which was very strong once upon a time, maybe 3 decades ago. It stopped, of writers, artists coming together And I think the last version of that was the opposition to nuclear weapons, and the conferences that were held and attracting range of writers and thinkers, and Picasso, Sartre, Bertrand Russell, and before that, of course, the Spanish Civil War was that great sort of catalyst. And again, people coming together in Valencia in 1936, Octavio Paz, Neruda, all these people to talk about the challenges facing them. So I've very, self-consciously thought of what we're doing as part of that tradition, getting away from the commercial cultures of the literary festival or the kind of, academic protocols of university conferences. So a new kind of space where we can start to speak frankly about things, and in many cases we have barely begun to address some of these problems because of the enormous strength and force, power still left in, no longer persuasive but still dominant cognitive structures and tyrannies. So we need to escape from that very quickly. GGD is one thing that I'm doing. Another thing I'm doing with colleagues here, Mohsen and Nasreen, is equator.org, which is another attempt to bring in new experiences and perspectives into play here and just sort of expand our mind, expand our repertoire, our sort of toolkit. And again, I think in that context, to go back to the previous question about Russia, I think perspective perhaps from a different part of the world could be useful in the sense that I grew up. When I come to Europe, I'm very aware of the European fear of Russia. But having grown up in a Russia-philic country like India, I was extremely aware of the Russian fear of Europe. The fact that the two great Russian classics from War and Peace and Life and Fate by Vasily Grossman talk about this continuous violation of Russia by armies emanating in Europe. So when we think about this, and you're right, Jose, about Ukraine being this site of the most extreme forms of violence, but if you look at history from the Russian perspective, invading armies from France, from Germany, killing literally millions and millions of people, that's also something that plays very deeply on the Russian mind. Something that happened that only really stopped in 1945 and was stopped because then they created that buffer going into Eastern Europe, planting satellite states there. So I would say if you take the perspective of people who've grown up, Russia, of course, the Russian imagination is deemed corrupt right now. But I think it'd be interesting to look to countries where Russia had a different kind of presence altogether, where Russian history or Russian perspectives were kind of, in a way respected and acknowledged, then we might look at this somewhat differently. And that's what I mean by expanding perspectives, and not remaining confined to one particular mode of thinking about the world.
And the Spanish issue, of course, there are these stupid debates because, if I may, because the president of Mexico asked Spain to ask for forgiveness for the colonization, for the genocide of the indigenous people that went together with the colonization of Mexico. And of course, the right would say no. The foreign minister said, yes, it was an injustice. But so we are caught up in stupid games on these issues that should be so easy to solve. On the one hand, there is also the way in which immigrants against immigrants. The extreme right is Islamophobic, so they are trying to attract Latino immigrants against Muslim immigrants. So those kind of things are going on. Today, Spain is the most open society to immigration, still relatively open and still open in every respect. But we have a very strong now Islamophobic party that was originally an anti-Catalan party. This is what made it into a big party, and then an anti-feminist party. So it's anti-Catalan, anti-feminism, and Islamophobic. This is the trinity of this party. So this. And the other thing is not only the writers. For me, the non-aligned movement was crucial for an alternative form of imagining the globe. It was not based on the binary capitalist socialist. I was very, very, very enthused and even very open to the BRICS, because for me the BRICS meant Brazil, South Africa, and India. three very, very complex societies, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, a mess, but democratic societies. And if they could develop, because neither Europe nor the US could be models of development for the rest of the world, but if India, Brazil, and South Africa can do it, anybody can do it. And so this was what, but then these societies themselves, the nation state, China, I have no problem with Chinese civilization, I love it. And Chinese empire was able to accommodate the Tibetan Buddhists, accommodate the Xi'an Uyghurs, Muslims. It's the Chinese national state that cannot do it. So the problem is not Chinese culture, it's the Chinese national state. The problem is not Indian culture, it's the Indian nation state that is the problem. So here we are. As long as China thinks in terms of a Chinese nation state competing with our nation states, we are doomed. We are doomed. So only if Chinese can think beyond the nation state and think that China is much greater if it's incorporated, because it was to incorporate these diasporas, but it cannot as long as it's a nation state. And it can and doesn't want to have Muslims and Buddhists. So anyhow, it's a mess, and we'll have to work on it.
I was seeing Yasnaya clapping, and we have a lot of hands. I was wondering whether we could have 10 or 15 minutes of extension. We don't have a panel afterwards for the first time in the dialogues. Could we just have, what do you think, Tom?
Of course. Sure, yeah.
Of course.
So here's the conversation.
Okay, Paul, here, Nicoleta, you. Could you maybe collect the 4 questions and then respond to them?
Sure.
Okay, Paul.
Thank you. Pankaj, you say that Europe won't amount to much unless it can incarnate some very basic moral values. It's a persistent argument from the right that the reason that Europe can't incarnate basic moral values is that it's cut itself off from religion in its charter, in its institutions, in its civic life, which is striking in light of the fact that, as you point out, Maritain was so vital to the formation of Europe, and the Christian Democrats were so vital, as Jose pointed out. So what do you make of that critique from the right, that Europe can't incarnate moral values because it's cut itself off from religion?
We collect the questions first, and then we.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the thoughts and food for thought that you are providing. I just want to speak as a scholar from the Global South, a woman of color. And we say that decolonizing systems and structures begins with recognition that we live in a world led by white male with power and privilege. Could you please talk about how do you see the specific leadership traits and what women and women leaders contribute, particularly as we live in an equal world where our leaders, political leaders, lack moral fiber, and the example of the ongoing genocide is a particular example of, how their response is to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Here, Nicoleta.
Marilyn McMahon, Georgetown. For 3 days, I think I've been hearing we can't realize the promise of this, in particular today, the European Union, European Court of Human Rights, for which I have great respect, unless we deal with. And the unless we deal with have been anti-Semitism, have been decolonization, it's been, colonization. And in the American case, we have never dealt with slavery and our treatment of the indigenous. And the Trump phenomenon linking itself to this right populist fascism is also a reaction to Barack Obama being the president of the United States, backlash. So I hope that we will keep talking about what we can do to confront the evils and, in a religious sense, the sins of our past, in order to really try to be able to move forward to building the structures that will create human well-being and flourishing, or in the religious terms, grace.
Thank you. perhaps my question is somewhat complementary to the one that Paul asked. You were asked whether you have references to intellectuals who from Europe addressed the issue of Europeanness. It's fantastic to realize that the nation state, which seems to be the problem in Europe, was also somewhat questioned from within when it was born, with essentially Romanticism and the 19th century, from Mazzini and Victor Hugo to William Stead, later Coudenhove-Kalergi, down to Spinelli. There is a long tradition of Europeanists who somewhat threatened the main problem from within, not to mention other Europeanists from Ortega y Gasset, even Semprún, who came up the other day in a discussion, Salvador de Madariaga, Lorenzo, people who, while decrying the loss of Europe, are also reinstating the value of Europe beyond its colonial power. So my question is, do you think there is still room for a kind of recuperation, retrieval of this very rich internal European tradition as a possible interlocutor to the narrative that we also want to produce, meaning a Europe that has to decolonize itself from itself?
Hi, thank you for your thoughts. My question is kind of going to the same way. So since we've been talking about mostly about the pulling forces of the United States and Europe, I'm quite curious now to learn more about the narrative that shared Jose about the need of Europeans to know their pasts in order to evolve. Because you, Pankaj, as well, shared Camus, some ideas of Camus, of Simone Weil, who were intellectuals that were engaged against colonialism. So it's a kind of going back to some moral and ethical values of Europe from the time of la Renaissance during the 18th century, etc., etc. So I would want to hear your thoughts about the need of Europeans to know their pasts, apart from just being the victims of America. Because they have also a history towards other countries, for example, the North Africa, or other countries that have been colonized. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these rich questions. Would you like to address some of them, all of them?
Yes. Again, where do we start? I have to admit that more important than going back to our past is to engage in the culture of the encounter among us, among the people of the world today. So we should not try to, obviously we need to at least know something about the past, because especially when narratives of who we are constructed to deny precisely immigration, to deny certain rights, to even present ourselves as higher than others. So in this respect, we need then to counter with counter narratives. But otherwise, we should not be obsessed about the past. The important thing is to understand how we as a global humanity have come to become a global reality. This is the important thing. For me, is understand the process of globalization the last 500 years through which we've developed. Some of you are most interested and think that everything can be understood in terms of global capitalism. Others think that this the global system of nation states. For me, it's the global system of religions, which of course we think are very old, but all of them are very new. All the isms we have were invented in the last 200 years. There was no Protestantism before, no Catholicism before, no Christianity. Of course there were, but not their names. Nobody knew the name Judaism, or Confucianism, or Hinduism, or Buddhism. Those are products of these civilizational encounters. Islam is the only that rejected this denomination, Mohammedism, and they fought for it. And now they are denominated Islam the way they want to be called. So the point is, this is the kind of issue, how we recognize each other as part of this global humanity. And I think for this, we have to simply be open to know not so much about our own past, but the histories of the others and how we came together, how the encounters we've had in the last 500 years that has formed all of us.
So thanks for the great questions, and maybe to try to weave several of them together. On gender, we haven't talked about gender directly too much, but certainly a lot of the traits or qualities of the current scene that we've been critical of over the last few days map onto a traditional definition of masculinity or hyper-masculinity, aggressiveness, intolerance, self-centeredness, cruelty. And clearly we have men, white men in powerful positions, not just in politics, but in the technology sector and others who exemplify those values. It relates a little bit to the first conversation we had about solidarity and our concern that solidarity itself is not necessarily good or bad. What kind of solidarity? There are solidarities among these elites that I've just described that are driving us in the wrong way. There's a solidarity of nationalism and tribalism. How do we generate a solidarity based on a broader conception of human solidarity, of human fraternity? How do we grasp at universalism again as a frame, a global frame? We had a great panel earlier today, some of you were there, about the Global South and the danger of generalizing about the Global South, about the globe for that matter. And yet we are hesitant, and we should be hesitant to give up on the idea of human universalism and basic notions of human dignity and solidarity that encompass everyone. And maybe just to link from that to Paul's question about European values and the secular, the fact that the church and religion has all but disappeared from the public sphere in most of Europe. At the last edition, if you like, the last convening of the Global Dialogues in June, the focus was on fraternity, which is a religious notion. We are engaging with the thought of Pope Francis in particular, and his idea that we're all brothers and sisters. I do think there are powerful ways of translating that into a secular idiom, and in a way that's what we've been doing here, and that the European dedication to human rights as a principle within the European Union and more globally has that spirit behind it, completely compatible with a religious worldview, but still grounded in other ways. And to link it back to our broader theme of Europe and America, that Europe has more credibility, not great credibility, but more credibility than the United States in talking about human rights, partly because of that experience that I referred to, of getting through the wars and building institutions and finding a way to articulate universal values that incorporates different religious and secular traditions.
Thank you, Tom. I think the idea of empowerment, which is really I suppose the dominant idea of our times, like the modern world is there to empower us individuals. And I think in many ways we are seeing in certain kinds of political behavior, for instance, the strongmen phenomena, which is, very clearly represents a sort of backlash to the gains of the feminist movement. I think, some people say it explicitly, like, now we can do all the things that Me Too prevented us from doing, at least for a while. There is a sense that the gains of social liberalism have gone too far. They've been too widely extended, and it's now time to pull back. So yes, definitely there is an attempt to claw back the power that was lost due to these social justice movements. And I think that puts into question this, whole idea of power. And, one of certainly my intention is to complicate this notion of power. And I think you will see, human fragility. And in that sense, I would like to also apply that to intellectual life. When we talk about people like Simone Weil, we're not really, there are no very clear lessons to be drawn from people like her or Albert Camus. They can help us. They can be very instructive to engage with. But I think, clearly drawing lessons from them and applying to our current situation is not going to help. Let's see them as individuals engaged with some of the most serious crises of their times, responding to them, often with confusion, with ambivalence. You know, I quoted Albert Camus very favorably a little while ago, but I can say, and I think, you know, it's easily verified, that on the question of colonialism, which he denounced, when it came to an actual anti-colonial movement in Algeria, he was profoundly ambivalent there. So what I'm trying to say is that these lessons are not so easily drawn of the kind we want for quick consumption. I think we have to really engage more deeply with these thinkers and actually learn that we've all been, in different ways, we're all embattled with the historical conjunctures we find ourselves in, and these are some of the resources we can draw upon as we move forward. But really the important thing is engagement, is to keep alive the memory of these traditions, to keep and to re-emphasize their importance. And that's what, you know, I suppose these sort of, you know, gatherings are aimed at doing.
If I may add, on religion, if I may add, since supposedly is my area of expertise, or at least of disciplinary study, I mean, I think what is, I would emphasize, European societies are becoming post-secular societies in the way in which Habermas understood it. I've been part of these debates. Post-secular doesn't mean that they are religious again, or they are not secular anymore. It means that they reflect upon the fact that to be secular doesn't mean to have overcome religion. The secularity is not what comes after religion, but the secular is the space in which non-believers and believers and all kinds of beliefs really can live together and work together, which actually was the original theological meaning of Augustine in the City of God, when pagans and Christians could work together towards the common good until the second coming. But precisely I was struck by this image that one of you mentioned, that we are all in this church without riches and without priests. No, we are actually in a very, very large global church. All of us here with many, many competing rituals, many, many competing priests, and we simply have to learn to celebrate rituals together and create new rituals in which we can share. This is what is needed. I actually am much more hopeful about religious people. I mean, I had this meeting with Jews, Muslims, Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox right a few hours ago. And I just came from Cape Town, the G20, the Forum on Religions, basically where you have really, really religious leaders talking to one another and discussing our pressing global issues in a way in which secular intellectuals and secular politicians are not doing today. So I have more faith today on religious people being able to really, really talk to one another and try to work together on many of those issues that secular people are. I'm sorry for this note, but
we could continue the dialogue for a lot of time. Thank you, Pankaj. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Jose. We'll leave it up here, and we'll continue tomorrow. Thank you, everyone, for coming.